Good afternoon, City of Rochester, organizations, nonprofits, community members. We're really excited to have you join us again today for another session of the Equity Series. Again, the Equity Series is a part of the Equity Alliance, a partnership between the City of Rochester and Destination Medical Center. And we're excited to bring these learning sessions to you each day. I'm typically here with my co-host, Rafael Khalifa, but as it is Eid today, she is unable to join us, but we want to send, of course, greetings to her, her family, and all of our community members who are in the Muslim community as they celebrate today. So if you have those in your network, remember to send them Happy Eid. Again, as a reminder, the Equity Alliance has an aspiration, and that is to co-create a healthier Rochester where everybody gets to participate equitably in the design of public policy. And then our purpose and goals are to deliver equitable outcomes to all people all the time. And today, we are really excited to have Heather Hyatt join us. She will be covering the topic quite broadly on empowering women in the workplace, specifically talking about breaking barriers and building success in the state of Minnesota. We did send out a longer overview of Heather's work, but in summary, Heather is the director of the Office on the Economic Status of Women at the Minnesota Legislative Coordinating Commission. It is a nonpartisan office that advises the legislature and provides information and statistics on women in Minnesota. Heather has her master's degree in public policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs of the University of Minnesota, where she studied election administration, local government, and gender representation. I'll also take a minute to talk a little bit and say Heather is a previous teammate, which I always say a forever teammate. She worked for the City of Rochester as a management analyst, and so we're really excited to have her join us again. And we will be looking at the chat throughout the session. Heather has indicated that feel free to ask questions or make comments throughout her session, and I will be monitoring the chat to ensure that we get the questions to her. If we're not able to answer everything during the session, we'll collect those and send responses back to you when we send the presentation to everyone. So with that, take a moment and extend your welcome to Heather. Heather.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be back with you all. It's an honor to be here to give you a little update on my new position at the legislature and talk about women in the workplace. So let's get started here. So I'm going to go over some historical important legislation, mostly at the Minnesota level, and then I'll talk about data specific to women in the state and some recent legislation and its impacts on women throughout the state. So first of all, Chow talked a little bit about this on my office. It's the Office on the Economic Status of Women, which is really a mouthful, trying to tell people what I do. My business card is like just absolutely ridiculous. But really, I'm here as a liaison between residents and community members and legislators, and I share information. So it's like a funnel. I share information both ways with people. And if any of you ever need or have questions about legislation that's going on, I'm happy to help with that. And I have my contact information that I'll share at the end of the presentation as well. So let's get started and talk about some progress we've made over the last 100-ish years in the state of Minnesota. I'm not going to talk about each and every bullet on this slide, but I'll highlight some really important ones. But starting with women's suffrage, which officially happened in 1920, Minnesota passed it in 1919, which again is only just over 100 years ago. Lots of stuff happened between 1919 and 1964, but I'm keeping this a little bit more modern. So I'm going to talk about the wage rate prohibition in 1969, but back up a step and say that in 1964, the federal government passed the Equal Pay Act, which was really monumental. But did that solve the gender pay gap that we see in this country? No. It did not, and we'll talk about that further as we continue to move on. But lots of activity was happening in the 60s and 70s, which kind of corresponds with the feminist movement, if you are familiar with that. But discriminatory wage rates were prohibited in Minnesota specifically in 1969. My office was created in 1976. Back then, it was technically the legislative office, or it was the Legislative Council on Economic Status of Women. It had public members and legislative members, and so that has changed slightly over time, and I'm now in the Legislative Coordinating Commission. And I don't have I don't have a council really at all. I have an advisory council of legislators. So I have 2 senators and right now 1 representative. We're waiting on 1 more appointment to my advisory council. But my office has not been staffed in 6 years. So the funding for the office was removed in 2017 and just returned in 2023. So I got hired in November of last year, and happy to pick this role back up. There were previously 5 directors of the office, and they all are legends in their own right and have worked on really important legislation that I'm going to talk about next. So the 2 big ones I'm going to focus on this page are the State Government Pay Equity Act and the Local Government Pay Equity Act, which passed in 1982 and 1984. And those are both very actually different governors and bipartisan, so passed by Republican and Democrat in office. And the unique piece to the Local Government Pay Equity Acts and the State Government Pay Equity Acts for Minnesota is that it's about comparable worth, meaning that similar jobs that require the same experience and same working conditions, for example, should be paid the same. So that means if you are a custodial worker or a clerical worker, and it's about the same level of education you're required and you have roughly the same working conditions, you should be getting paid the same. And this was important because they weren't getting paid the same. And there had been a study done prior to this in the late 70s, leading up to the State Government Pay Equity Act passing, that showed that this was a problem, a really pervasive problem throughout state government. So the first director of the office, Nina Rothschild, then went on to enforce the State Government and Local Government Pay Equity Act. So she left the OESW and went on to head that role. So those are really important pieces of legislation in Minnesota. And the last report on the State and Local Government Pay Equity Acts that my office produced in 2016 showed that the pay gap was really whittled down to about 91 cents. So there was only a 9-cent difference between men and women that were in state and local government employment throughout the state. And that's a really big deal. So I'm going to be working on updating that report soon, and hopefully we'll have that published next year. Some other interesting things here that in 1984, credit cards, it allowed, the legislature passed a law allowing married women to get a name in their current name or in their former surname. That's only 40 years ago. 40 years ago. That's just really remarkable to me. And then similarly in 87, the Human Rights Act was expanded to prevent discrimination for granting credit on the basis of sex or marital status. And then going on, some other, spousal credit history wasn't removed until 1998. And then the other big one that my office was pretty instrumental in helping pass was the Women's Economic Security Act, which has been strengthened in recent years, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But this was a really big deal. The first thing it did was increase the minimum wage to $9.50. And we'll talk about why increasing the minimum wage is really important for women. Hint, most Minnesotans that work a minimum wage job are women. The next thing it was pretty big in affecting was expanding the Parental Leave Act from 6 weeks to 12 weeks. And it also allowed for older women to save for their retirement with the Minnesota Retirement Savings Plan. So it gave small private sector employees without an employer-sponsored retirement plan to pool into a state-managed program. that doesn't sound like it's a big deal, but it is because of a culmination of factors. Women make less than men, and therefore they are going to have less in retirement. So that was really important tool for older women to have access to secure savings as well. All right. Okay, so let's talk about, oops, sorry, let me scooch that over. What are the numbers on women in Minnesota? So first of all, we like to normally say that women are what, 51% of the population worldwide? Yep. In Minnesota, we're just a little bit lower than average at 49.8%, but for all intents and purposes, we're about 50%. And this is the racial and ethnic backgrounds of Minnesotans. You know this already. Rochester, though, is of course a little bit more diverse than the state as a whole. We see that, hold on, let me go over this. Two or more races is at about 2.8%, American Indians 1.4%, Asian at 5.4%, Black at 7.6%, and Hispanic at 5.9%. And then the foreign-born population, and I think there's been updates that just came out this week. I think it's had some big headlines because the majority of foreign-born Americans live in 4 states in the country. But alas, here's our foreign-born population split up by sex, which is actually 51.4% female and 48.6% male. And the median household income, again, so I've hinted at this a little bit, but women make less money than men. So it shouldn't really be a surprise here that the median household income for female-headed households is $72,900 compared to men. It's $84,000. And again, this is statewide, not regional. And then the percentage of women living in poverty is higher than men, of course. Since we make less money, we're more likely to be in poverty as well, with 294,112 people in 2022, with men at about 245,967. All right, so I've alluded to this a little bit, but let's get more specific with what the wage gap is. So women make less money than men. In 2024, women working full-time and year-round are paid on average 84 cents to every dollar that are paid to men. And that's a federal number that came out from the Census Bureau on Equal Pay Day, which was March 12th. And the significance of that date is that that's how far into the year women have to work to make the same amount of money as a man. Now let that sink in, because when we look at the Minnesota specific information on the disaggregated data, you'll see that like Latina women, for example, have to work into August for their equal pay day. And that should be really disheartening. And again, talking about the wage gap, it isn't actually the size of the gap, but the ratio, which is a weird nuance of how we talk about this, but that's what it is. And it is often calculated based on earnings for women and men who work full-time year-round in order to control for the differences in work hours and experience. And this is important too, because we know repeatedly, and this is a long-standing fact, that women work less hours than men. There has been some movement with actually both men and women working less hours than they have, say, 20 years ago, but men still work more hours for pay, I should say, than women do. So why is there a gender wage gap? There's lots of things that go into it. Some of these factors on the screen here reduce the gap, and some of them enhance the gap. So I'll talk a little bit about some of them. But we know that education is a factor that helps women, and women have been graduating from college at higher rates since, well, they've been enrolled in higher rates in education since the 1980s, and we now surpass and obtain bachelor's degrees at higher rates than men. but we still have a wage gap, which has confounded scholars a bit. But we have all these other factors that also go into what causes the disparity between the two. And some of the big ones here are occupation and industry. Men and women don't always go into the same field, and we pay people differently based on the field of work that they're in. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit here. But another big one is race and ethnicity. We'll look at the disaggregated data here in a little bit. The usual weekly hours worked. Again, I just noted that men work more hours than women. Experience and work history can also be a factor. And we know that women are more likely to leave the workforce when they have children, for example. So that also plays into and creates a long-term effect on lifetime earnings, because if they leave the workforce for a bit, it affects their work history and then potentially what their pay is down the road. Age can also be a factor, and a lot of the recent research here actually shows that women, and this is focused mostly on women who are getting college degrees, but women right out of college are making almost the same. There's almost no gap, but after 5 to 10 years, that gap starts to get bigger. So that's a really interesting finding as well. And then discrimination and unexplained factors are, of course, also big pieces in the gender wage gap. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. Most of the rest of the data in my presentation is coming from this like really, truly wonderful report. There's a link to this in the slides that you all will get afterwards, but this report is extremely comprehensive. It reviews the economic factors, which I'm mostly focusing on here, but there's a lot of information as well on some social factors. I think, hold on, they categorize it. I'm looking at the actual printed paper copy. Safety and health and leadership. So there's lots of great details in this, let's see, 100 and something page. No, it's 59 pages report. But here we are. This is the specifics on the gender wage gap in Minnesota. And I'm leading with this disaggregated information because it should cause everyone to pause for a moment. Latino women make 57 cents to the dollar. Native American women, 64 cents to a white man's dollar. Black women, 62 cents. Asian Americans, 72 cents. And white women get 82 cents. And I don't have the graphic here specifically, but the last number I saw from this report for Somali women, they make 41 cents to the dollar. And Hmong women make 54 cents to the dollar. So that is a really big disparity. And when we talk about, so I mentioned earlier, the federal gap is 84 cents. So Minnesota is 81 cents. And we're about halfway. We're in the midpoint in the country. So we're better than half the states and we're worse than half the states in this space. And this number has not budged in about a decade. It has been hovering around 80 cents since 2011. And it has gone up slightly, but stayed very similar over the last decade. So it's pretty persistent. And truly, one of the big factors here, I mentioned this earlier, but is I'm going to go back for a second because that slide is very distracting because it's got lots of colors. Is the occupation or industry that you choose to go in. So women tend to be in health care and care-related fields, which pay less than other more science fields, if you will. The first one that comes to mind is mining and construction, because I can see that next graph, but I'm going to wait to show it to you again. And this is actually a really big reason for the gender wage gap, because the type of job that you go into determines how much pay you get. And these care professions tend to get paid less. And so we can see the healthcare support field is very heavily female dominated. It's in Minnesota specifically, it's 82% of that field is is female. And actually, it's very driven. It's got a lot of people of color in that field as well, and it is paid much less. Personal care and service is pretty similar at 80%. Health technologists and technicians is 79%. Health diagnosing and treating practitioners, 77%. And then we go into the educational instruction and library, very female dominated with 73%. And office and administrative support is 72%. And then the fields that are predominantly male throughout Minnesota: construction and extraction, which is 96%, installation, maintenance, and repair, 96%, transportation, 87%, architecture and engineering, 84%, law enforcement is 82%, farming, fishing, and forestry, 80%. So this dovetails actually pretty nicely with a lot of the work that Chow does with the city and the Women in the Built Environment program specifically, because as we train women to go into these fields, we know these are higher paying jobs. So if we were to sort this based on the highest male percentage to the highest female percentage, like if I sorted this by color, so it was all green in this field up here. I'm pointing at my screen. You can't see me pointing at my screen. Oh my goodness. I'll use my cursor here. So if we sorted this differently, it actually coincides with average pay. So average pay is much higher for the male dominated fields than it is for the female dominated fields. And it's a difference of like $14 or so for childcare. $14 an hour is the average rate for childcare workers compared to construction and extraction, which is around $21 to $24 an hour. So there's a direct correlation between the occupation and field you go into and how much pay you're getting. Now, how do we fix that? We can't just automatically make women go into jobs that are traditionally male jobs, right? Like that at a policy level, that's insurmountable almost, I would say, right? Like we can't just make people change. There are a lot of reasons why people choose caregiving positions over construction and instruction positions. And some of it is how we are nurtured, if you will, and how we're raised, but also some people just gravitate to those fields. So at a policy level, we can't necessarily change that, except that we can. And for women that are interested and want to go into those fields, we should encourage it and make sure they have the resources to stay in those professions as well once we get there. So I know that's been a big focus at the state level, is we offer lots of grants and opportunities for women in these fields, but the retention piece is also getting to be very important. So it's not just for the women, it's also for the employers. It's important for them to know that there are differences between men and women in the workplace, and how do we help retain and keep those employees, because we do have a workforce issue in the state. So this is really interesting. This has a really big, it's anywhere between 40 and 50% of the wage gap is because of this. So it varies based on the researcher that you're talking to, but yeah, 40 to 50% of the wage gap is based on the occupation and industry that you go into. And I mentioned this earlier, but women make up 56% of all minimum wage workers in the state of Minnesota. So that is another, that should make you raise your eyes a little, right? Like that's interesting. And if you live in greater Minnesota, it's about 58% of women are in minimum wage jobs.
Heather, can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about why, even with advanced degrees, this is the case?
Well, yes. Because that usually comes down to a work history issue, or they've been out of the workforce for some time, or they took time off and they're working less hours is where we see some of those gaps. Great question. Any other questions before I move into recent legislation? And things to talk about. I should note here for a moment about the workforce issue. Minnesota actually is second in the nation, just behind District of Columbia, with 66% of our 16-year-old plus female workforce is working. Okay, let me say that a different way because I added too many words. 66% of the labor force, or women, are in the labor force. That's the second highest in the nation, which is remarkable. That's great. However, we still know we have a workforce issue. And we're seeing that across the state in various jobs. So we know we need to, because we have more job openings than we have eligible employees or employees to work them, we know we still need to be recruiting people to work in jobs in Minnesota. So anything we can do to help women and just bump up their participation slightly is helpful for everyone in the state. Employers, the economy generally, like any incremental movement we can make in that is helpful. So speaking of that, and some recent legislation that has passed that affects women, we're going to talk about the Paid Family Leave Act. So this passed last year, and it goes into effect in 2026. And some of the highlights here, again, I mentioned in 2014, the Women's Economic Security Act increased the unpaid leave for up to 12 weeks. So this will allow workers to take up to 12 weeks of leave for family or medical reasons, and 20 weeks total in a year. And the wage replacement rates are progressive, with lower income workers receiving a higher percentage of their income in benefits. And those earning $15 an hour and working 40 hours a week could see up to 90% of their wages replaced. So that's really important because, as we know, women are making less, but they're going to see more of their wages replaced under this program. So this affects men and women, right? Anyone is eligible for this, but because we know women are making less money, it'll have more of an impact on women. And again, when you get this presentation, you'll have a link here to some additional FAQs. There was also the Earned Sick and Safe Time that passed last year, which went into effect January 1st of this year. This one is really interesting. I know there's been a lot of talk at the local government level and how this affects on-call workers, for example, and I know they're trying to work through some legislation on that right now. But essentially what the Earned Sick and Safe Time did was expanded the eligible uses that employees can take time off for their own, or a family member's mental or physical illness, treatment, or preventative care. It also includes ability to use the time due to domestic abuse, sexual assault, or stalking of themselves or a family member. And then a closure, like if there's a workplace closure of the employee, they can use their Earned Sick and Safe Time to cover that time they had planned to work. So if there are weather events, for example, or a public emergency and the workplace is closed, they could use their Earned Sick and Safe Time. It also really expands the list of people they are eligible to use the time off for. So it includes their own, immediate family members, but if they have foster children, they could use it for that as well, as an example. So it just provides more time because we all have issues that arise, right? We're all human and we all face these issues. But it can be really hard if you're working an hourly job to coordinate when somebody is going to have a physical illness and you need to take them to the doctor, for example. So that's where this Earned Sick and Safe Time can be really beneficial. And I'll actually just plug here for a second a really specific example at my workplace. So we have a handful of limited term employees who previously weren't earning sick time at the same rate, right? Because it's in their contract, but they are eligible for Earned Sick and Safe Time. And that was really helpful for them because they still have these issues, right? Like no matter what, as I mentioned, we're all human. Things come up for all of us. They're eligible to use Earned Sick and Safe Time when they need it. And then also in 2023, the legislature passed a pay history ban. So it prohibits employers from asking about or considering an applicant's past or current pay during the hiring process. And that went into effect January of this year. This also does not mean like if I'm interviewing for a new job and I'm negotiating my salary, I can offer what my previous salary was. It doesn't prohibit the candidate themselves from asking or sharing the information, but employers cannot ask. Um, so it applies to all job applicants, including current employees who are seeking internal promotions or transfers. It doesn't prohibit, like I just mentioned, the job applicant from disclosing their pay history, and it applies to all employers in the state. And then, so I did mention, so there's legislation right now to adjust the earned sick and safe time, some modifications to that law. And then there is another bill that has passed in the House, and hasn't been debated in the Senate yet. Excuse me, but it is called the pay transparency law, which would require employers to put the pay range on all job postings in the state. I think it is currently at employers that with 30 or more employees, but that could change depending on how that debate goes in the Senate, because I think one was 15 and one was 30. So anyway, more to come on that. That will likely pass and be in one of the omnibus bills this year. But that is another factor that can be really helpful because, as we mentioned, since women persistently are paid less, not providing, knowing how much a job is offering for wages is important for women. So it can also help to close the pay gap there. So I just gave you guys a lot of information. But what does this all mean for you? Essentially, it means pay attention. And if you have questions about legislation, I'm happy to help answer any questions you might have, but it's really important to be involved and watch what's going on at the legislature and or locally even. I, of course, say this because I worked in local government in Rochester, so I know that those city council meetings can be really fun to watch. But honestly, like, look at what the agenda is and see what's coming up that might have an impact on you. Um, yeah. Uh, what else was I going to say? Chow, you told me to mention something before we got
Um,
here.
yes, so a lot of this is, impacting federal and state and local governments, but we have folks who are from nonprofit organizations or private organizations. What are some things that they can do or think about or implement within their own organizations to kind of impact the gap between pay?
Yes. So what are things? Yeah. Okay. So like I mentioned on a lot of, I think nonprofits are doing the pay salary thing, requiring the posting of pay salaries. And I say that because I know of the Minnesota Council on Nonprofits, they have a job posting board, and they require anyone who posts a job on their board in the state of Minnesota, they have to put their the pay rate, for example, on their job postings. So that's one thing that, I mean, if you're already posting your jobs with the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, they require it, but that can be a really important tool and helpful tool to recruit more women into the workplace. But in general, like the benefits packages generally are super important for all workers, but women specifically, getting into the workforce. Other things that help. Uh, there's a lot about childcare. Thank you. I was just getting there. I see Julie put a question in the chat about childcare. That is a super important topic that I am tracking closely. Let me read your question, Julie. It says, are you looking at correlations between lack of childcare access and availability and how that is impacting women in the workforce? Yes, absolutely. We know it has a great impact. I'm going to call it a childcare crisis in this state. I mean, I think this status of women and girls in Minnesota notes that Minnesota is 10th in the country for the cost of infant childcare. It costs on average $16,000 a year for center-based child care for an infant, which is more than it is tuition to go to the University of Minnesota. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. I'm currently paying tuition for my 1-year-old, but guess what? I can't take a loan to cover childcare costs. But hopefully one day if he goes to college, I would be able to take a loan out to cover that cost. That's pretty remarkable. And that does have a big impact. I don't have numbers specifically on it, but we see it having a greater impact in greater Minnesota as well. We've seen more childcare facilities closing in greater Minnesota and home daycares closing as well. So we know there are direct impacts. There is legislation introduced this year. It is Senator House-Child out of Duluth and Representative Katoyza-Gatun out of Eden Prairie, and their bill is called the Great Start Affordability Act. I don't think it's getting funded though because it's a non-budget year and it has a pretty big price tag. But essentially the goal of that legislation was to keep families from paying more than 7%, which is the federal recommendation of your total income towards childcare in a year. And I think right now in Minnesota, we're paying around 20% of our income is going towards, on average, is going towards childcare. So that's remarkable. And it does have an impact too. The other plug I will say about how childcare affects women more specifically is that we know generally, I have been alluding to this all along, but women take on the more of the burden of the unpaid care work that happens at home. And so they're more like they work less hours, for example, in a week, and they're more likely to be the one that is taking their children to appointments or staying home if their children are sick, for example. And so that affects, workforce participation. They're more likely to leave the workforce in total when they have children, also because of their ability to find childcare. So yes, it is a drastic impact. It's not the only reason that they leave the workforce, but it is a big reason. The other really wonderful book that I've read recently is this one called Career in Family, and it's written by Claudia Golden. She won the economic prize or the Nobel Prize in economics last year, and the first woman to do it independently. So she won it on her own. But she does a lot of research and she notes that like the prime time for women, college educated women to be up for a promotion at work is also their prime childbearing years, which impacts that wage gap as well. So when you're up for that promotion at work might also be the time that you are about to have a baby and or potentially leave the workforce for a short amount of time. To have kids. So that also has some long-term effects on the wages that we earn and our retirement over time. The Status of Women and Girls report notes that the wage gap results in almost a $500,000 earnings gap in a lifetime, and that's for white women. If you're Latino or Black, it's $1 million. Over a lifetime.
Huge differences. Yeah,
Big differences.
Thank you for sharing that, Heather. I was just looking at comments in the chat. And Kim, I don't know if you're able to unmute. You put a comment in here that said the city wage grid comes to mind, but I'm not sure what the context for that was. Do you know if you want to expand on that?
Sure. Yeah, Parks and Rec was having a difficult time recruiting folks, and they appropriately adjusted the wage grid because those were underpaid positions. They were very comparable to positions at the library. And we made the decision that we wanted that to be on par. But we never got the additional money to support that wage increase as part of the budget process. Had we not done it, that gap would have continued to increase. That's just a more recent thing. On the whole, I'm very proud of Rochester for their efforts to address pay equity issues, and I know that I have benefited from that, but I see every day how that creeps back, right? And it speaks to a lot those areas where people tend to work. Education fields, libraries are very female dominated, and when you're competing with comparable jobs, oh well, we need to pay our people higher because the market for that job is higher. We can't attract good people unless they're higher, but your market isn't, so you don't need to. I heard that many times in those kinds of conversations. So it's not like a one and done kind of thing, or we have a process and it's good. There are a lot of complex factors, and I'm sorry, I'm not the one giving this presentation. I'm just sharing my experience, and I'll shut up now.
No, Kim, you bring up all great points, and a note there about the Local Government Pay Equity Act that requires local government jurisdictions to report every 3 years and make corrections by the end of the year. And I know the person who works with the local governments to help rectify when they have issues. She's a wonderful human being and works really hard and diligently to make those corrections. But she hears that constantly as well, that is always a pushback. But we have a recruitment and retention issue across the board. Like that's not necessarily, I mean, we have ebbed and flowed over time, and the economy generally, of course, impacts what that looks like and our unemployment rate. But we have a persistently low unemployment rate, and we still have job openings across the state. So we know, and I mean, we get into the demographics of the state as well. Minnesota isn't really growing much. So we need to be mindful of what the workforce looks like into the future. And the way the presentations I've heard from the state demographer lately about that is in-migration is the factor that really can help us grow our workforce as well. But like I mentioned, like any incremental changes we can do to help women get back into the workforce or be in the workforce will help employers and the economy overall.
Anyone else have some reflections or questions? I'm good at the awkward pausing to allow people to think about it for a minute. If not, I do have a quick question as people are marinating on that. Heather, you talked a little bit about retention of women in predominantly male fields. And it gave me a moment of thought, because we often hear, well, why can't we just get more women to go into what are currently male-dominated fields, and that will just kind of resolve the pay equity issue. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what is the responsibility of an employer that is recruiting women into a male-dominated field, because that's something I think we don't pay enough attention to. We pay a lot of attention to the women, but not necessarily to employers.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what is the responsibility of the employer? Well, it's really, if an employer is thinking about it as an investment and they want to protect their investment that they're making, because it can be costly to train people into these spaces, they should be thinking about then retaining those employers or employees. So how can you make your workplaces more conducive to hosting female employees? We've seen policies passed in the state requiring paid breaks to express milk, for example. That legislation was carried by Senator Coleman, who's a Republican out of Waconia. So we've seen some bipartisan support in those spaces as well that affect women. That's just one example that I'm coming up with off my mind, but I think that this is we've been doing a lot of this work to try to encourage women to go into these fields for a while now. And I think that's what we're wanting to see more of is, okay, how can we help with the retention in these spaces? Because we've been doing it for like 20-ish years or so, but that number is still pretty persistently low. I think I think it's moved by 2%. Like it has become 2% more female construction has in the last decade in the state of Minnesota. So there's still room to grow.
Yeah, and I think I would, just reflecting on it, I would add to that in saying that organizations in general or employers don't often think about what they need to change within their own spaces. So from an equity standpoint, which is where I usually am, I would reflect on that portion more rather than, working as hard as we have for as long as we have, Heather, and not seeing a huge shift in getting women into those male-dominated fields. Is there a responsibility that as employers that we have? Are there cultures that we need to change? Are there policies in our employment process, but also maybe even in our reporting processes? So if a woman joins a male-dominated field and has a poor experience, what is the process that is in place that would allow her to be able to be retained through whatever the circumstance is, right? So, I see Kim saying in the chat, I don't think issues of sexual harassment have gone away. So how as employers, in our own spaces, are we thinking about the policies that we have in place that would support women as they join these fields? So just wanted to add that in there. Any other thoughts or reflections from others? Okay, I have one more and then Heather, maybe we'll let you go. My second one was around paid family leave. There've been a lot of questions about, well, yes, we're doing this, encouraging families and women particularly to be able to thrive and be retained in the workforce. But then there's the other component of particularly small businesses that say, how are we going to be able to manage this from an economic standpoint? So I think I would love to hear your feedback on those two what seems like competing priorities.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly do know that there's been pushback from the business community in this space. But I'm going to continue to focus on this workforce aspect, right? Like if we don't have the people to work in these places of employment to begin with, then we don't have these employers. These businesses are going to struggle anyway. So I think keeping that in mind, that the human nature of the workforce, that we are people, we all have issues, run across issues. We know we have what do we call it, the sandwich generation now, like as baby boomers start to retire and millennials and Gen Z start to have kids, they're maybe now carrying on both sides of the spectrum. So the ability to be able to take time off they still want their job, but they have caregiving responsibilities maybe on both sides that they need to be taking into consideration. That's really important. So I just continue to focus on the human aspect of how paid family leave affects Minnesotans generally, and it is good for employees. Yeah.
All right, I will give one last pause here in case anybody has a reflection or a question before we finalize the webinar.
Just to thank you, Heather. This has been really helpful and also validating. So thank you so much for your time. And I hope that we can continue to talk about this and advocate for change. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Julie. I will note I have my email and my phone up here. Truly, any issue you might see and you have a question about at the legislature, I'm happy to help try to point you in the right direction. I specifically follow all legislation that might have an impact on women. So I'm, like you mentioned earlier about childcare, I'm following childcare very closely. Any workforce issues specific to women, I'm following those. Domestic abuse and assault, sexual assault stuff I follow pretty closely. I read all the bill introductions. Every day there's bills introduced all session. And I will note we're coming up on 10,000 bills between the biennium. That's a lot of bills. I'm following 300 bills specifically related to women right now. So I kind of have my eyes on all the things. And I'm happy to give tours as well. So if you're up in the St. Paul area and want to tour the Capitol or need a connection to somebody, I'm happy to help with that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Heather. Unless anyone else has additional reflections or thoughts, we'll end by really saying thank you. And I know, the legislature has been in session, so this has been a really busy time for you. So we appreciate you taking the time to put the information together, providing us some historical context, as well as allowing us maybe to look ahead and be thoughtful about how, as employers, we can have considerations specific to women, and then disaggregating that maybe a little bit further even by race. And so we'll make sure to share the slides with everyone that's on the call. This webinar will also be posted on the DMC YouTube page for those who would like to review it later or share it with other folks. And again, our intention for the equity series is continuous learning, continuous improvement, with the hope that we will have some policy changes within our own workspaces, but particularly for our community as we're growing. So thank you, Heather. Have a great afternoon. And for the rest of you, I will wish you a good afternoon as well. And looking forward to seeing you next month, again, second week in May for another session of the Equity Alliance. Thank you.